the work that I did to ensure that we reached that agreement.
On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, hard or soft Brexit? For British Prime Minister Theresa May and her cabinet, that's still the biggest question. And China remains on the path of robust growth in the first half of this year. Could the trade war factor in the second half? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our program today with the latest on Brexit. A new round of Brexit negotiations is underway in Brussels despite bitter disagreements in the Parliament over the manner of exit. Early last week, the UK released its white paper on plans with the EU, something that did not sit that well with the Foreign Minister and the Brexit Secretary. Before we go to our panelists about the latest development, let's take a look at this.
Thorns in Brexit negotiations. The agenda for the latest round of Brexit talks in Brussels this week focused on issues related to a UK white paper on Mrs May's exit strategy from the EU. On Monday, the British Prime Minister barely won a series of votes in Parliament, keeping her contentious Brexit strategy with a few unwanted concessions.
The ayes to the right, 305. The noes to the left, 302.
Pro-Brexit lawmakers first voted 305 to 302 for the so-called customs bill and then approved amendments. The bill will stop Britain from collecting tariffs for the European Union after Brexit, unless there is a reciprocal arrangement. Instead of facing Brexit supporters down, the government accepted their 4 amendments and gained final pass of the bill.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that he is absolutely wrong in his reference to the agreement that was reached at Chequers. I would not have gone through all the work that I did to ensure that we reached that agreement, only to see it changed in some way through these bills. They do not change that Chequers agreement.
Mrs May's spokesman said the changes to the bill did little more than put the policy into law, and the government saw the amendments as consistent with the formal white paper last week. The white paper contains May's plan for a common rule book and a close relationship with the EU, which was unveiled after a cabinet rebellion led by resigned Foreign Minister Boris Johnson and Brexit Secretary David Davis. Dominic Raab soon became the new Brexit Secretary. Before their resignations, May and her cabinet had come to an agreement at Chequers for her soft Brexit plan. Complete break or friendly relations with Europe, that is indeed the big question.
For more discussion on Brexit, joining us in the Beijing studio, Cui Hongjian, who is the director of the Department for European Studies from the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. In London, the UK, we are joined by Ian Begg, a professor at the European Institute and co-director of Darendorf Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome, Professor. In Brussels, last but not least, we have Daniel Gross, who's the director of the Center for European Policy Studies. Welcome as well. I want to begin with you, Professor Begg. You are coming from the UK. Let me ask you about the latest development, particularly regarding the campaign, rather mistakes made by the official campaign group, which is called Vote Leave, exceeding the budget that it is legally allowed to encourage Britons to vote to leave the EU or Brexit. What does that mean politically for the to leave camp in a way?
Very little, because in practice we're talking about an overspending by hundreds of thousands of pounds. In other words, a relatively trivial amount on an election campaign, and it isn't going to call into question the outcome of the referendum. It may result in the Vote Leave group being subject to criminal penalties, but that's all. I can't see it being turned into something that would alter the outcome. And in any case, if there is close scrutiny of the other campaigning groups, they may well find similar irregularities. So I would discount this as something significant.
You see, there's not only personnel change, there's also campaign political, legal battles, and many other things. These could be said just little dramas along the way for the grand topic of Brexit. Having said that, though, let me go to Brussels, asking Mr. Gross about that, too. Coming from the EU perspective, what about that political struggle going on inside the UK, the so-called hard and the soft? You'd see it is almost coming to a climax over the past few weeks when the latest plan came into being. I mean, the draft, of course.
Yes, there's continuing uncertainty about what actually the position of the UK government will be. Makes it very hard for the European side to figure out what to expect, what to offer, and how to react to what is coming out of London. Because there's always a feeling that today you get one position paper, tomorrow it will be slightly different, and therefore for the time being we are still waiting here in Brussels for what could be the final position of what the UK actually wants to achieve with Brexit.
Well, not only in Brussels, I guess inside the UK, people do not even know what exactly is that blueprint, isn't it? Talking about blueprint, there is the latest one. Early in July, Mrs. May's cabinet reached an agreement on UK's future relationship with the EU after Brexit, the one that has caused a lot of stir recently. First, keep a common rule book for all goods with the EU, but, quote, different arrangements will be organized for services. The UK will sign a treaty on, quote, continued harmonization with the EU rules to avoid border tension. Some say this is just cherry picking that the May administration is trying to do. So, Mr. Cui, sitting in Beijing, of course, you don't have to go through those political storms, but I'm sure you have your assessment of the latest plan and the overall relationship fight inside the UK about that. Mr. Cui, briefly.
Yes, we are not, involved directly with this Brexit
What a relief.
game. But of course, we keep a very close concern because, as we know, China is an important partner, not only with UK and also with the European Union. So we need to understand what will happen for the future. Yes, I think now the situation, political situation in UK especially, is very difficult one for Theresa May and her government. And how could she keep the balance, very, very carefully between the so-called Leave campaign or Remain campaign. Of course, now it's in another form is a soft or hard Brexit.
Right.
Of course, I think also because now Theresa May's government is a very, very weak government. So we can understand this situation. But of course, I agree with our counterpart from Brussels that to some degree this position, especially recent position from the government, is a kind of a tactics for the negotiation.
Okay.
Maybe to firstly calm down some people in UK and also to release some goodwill to the Brussels. But then, of course, at the same time, Theresa May and his government should be prepared for any kind of negative response from other parts.
Well, talking about tactics, there are a lot of tactics being used. Mr. Gross, I have to go to you about Brussels' reaction, which I haven't seen officially so far, about Theresa May as the Prime Minister of the UK in a negotiation with the EU, talking about suggestions coming from the US President Donald Trump, suggesting to her, in her words, which is, Donald Trump suggested me to sue the EU. This is first. And secondly, she also talked about Donald Trump told me that he's going to offer to me a great trade pact that we're likely to have bilaterally, the United States and the UK, despite of the fact that she is not the favorite of Donald Trump, neither is Donald Trump her favorite. So, Mr. Gross, can you help us understand what exactly Brussels is reacting to these two pieces of news, shall we say?
Yes, I think we treat them as pieces of news and perhaps pieces of just gossip, because we know that
Really?
Donald Trump
Gossip?
says many things.
Really?
Yes, because he says many things to many partners, and he is perfectly capable of saying one thing one day and the opposite the next day. So what he might have said to Theresa May is really none of our business here in Brussels. As I said earlier, we are just waiting for an official position from the UK government. What exactly is their negotiating position? As long as they don't do that, there's very little for people in Brussels to do.
Oh, wow. Mr. Gross seems to want to have a rest so far before the next plan comes out. While the storm is going on inside the UK. Professor Bagg, I'm not sure whether you could take your time that leisurely as Mr. Gross.
Well, there are 2 or 3 things going on. One is that one piece of Trump advice is sticking with Theresa May, which is to make UK great. Put the UK first. Her position in this is one which tries to say this is what the UK ideally wants. Now, Theresa May's trouble is that within her main political base, which is the Conservative Party, both the members of Parliament, the party itself and the Cabinet, there is one faction that wants black, another faction which wants white, and she has tried to come up with a shade of grey that satisfies both of them. I think if you want black or if you want white, you're never going to be happy with grey. And we're seeing this playing out all the time in the way the negotiations happen.
Wow.
Now, on the European side, I think there's an important consideration here, which is that for the European side, an alternative to Mrs. May looks worse, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party or a more extreme Prime Minister from the Conservative Party. It'll be far harder for them to deal with. And they are worried that if they say something too negative about Theresa May's proposals, they will undermine her and create a difficulty for themselves.
Professor Bagg, you talk about the degree of grey. We all understand there's at least 50 degrees of grey, probably even more. And therefore, which degree will the Prime Minister take? That is likely to be the question, isn't it? I mean, talking about that, there's the issue of what we called earlier soft and hard at Brexit. There's also to leave and to stay campaigns on both sides. So this is the crucial issue. That is, what is the role of this Prime Minister? Elected into the office with the ultimate mission of so-called a Brexit. But obviously, politics have been moving around and evolving, so is international. So she has to find that perfect, beautiful degree of grey so that she will not be off from her executive office. Meanwhile, there could be a plan eventually to report to the voters.
Well, I think we have to be careful when we're talking about the book called 50 Shades of Grey, because that has different connotations.
That's
However,
true. That is true. That is true.
The story we're talking about here is that Theresa May has tried to make a compromise in the middle. If neither side is happy with it, it risks unravelling. And in the last 2 or 3 days, we've seen real concerns that it's unravelling with a very uncertain likely outcome. There are more voices now saying this has to go back to the people in some form of new consultation, which would mean in practice a second referendum. The trouble here is we're running out of time very rapidly. To get a new referendum in the UK is going to take several months, and the deadline for achieving a deal is now very close. It's either October or December or ultimately March next year, depending on who you listen to. So time is the essence now, and this is the major hazard that the whole process faces.
Mr. Cui, now we all understand that before the end of March 2019, which is just a few months from now, there has to be a result, according to the original plan, about the Brexit. But during this process, a lot of factors will come into being. One is whatever is going on within the internal politics, but without the influence, without not much influence from the outside world, but actually see the other way around. There's a lot of influence from the other side of the world. So, Mr. Cui, from your perspective, how do you look at the Brexit now, the process itself, reflecting the so-called unilateralism, vis-a-vis what is going on in the United States with President Trump traveling Europe over the past 2 weeks and ended up in Helsinki, and people's view about that version of unilateralism? How are they likely to intertwine or different, Mr. Cui?
Yes, I think it would be a very interesting issue if we look at this Brexit from this angle. Of course, not only a kind of, unilateralism, between the so-called Mr. Trump and of course, some, I think, the trend reflected from Brexit. I think largely we find out more maybe commonality from this, trend in the United States and also in the Brexit is how could this anti-establishment, force, they try to find a new way to reshape how it is national interests. If we look at especially the original beginning of the Brexit, how could this political elite to try to take use of a referendum and a kind of a populist movement to redefine the national interests.
Right.
And also what happened in Brexit, especially some populist party, they were so active during the referendum. And then what happened between especially those political leaders for populist parties in UK, and they are very, very close relations with Mr. Trump. So I think, yes, largely we can find out a more, very, very deep or root cause of this Brexit process, and in the huge change of the politics in UK and some other Western countries.
Mr. Gross, so what about from your perspective? What do you make of that, particularly given the recent events over the past few weeks? Very briefly from you, sir.
I think Mr. Trump perhaps was the same strand of populism that made Brexit possible, but he has also shown now that the world dominated by populists like him becomes more dangerous. And for a small power like the UK, it might actually have some advantage of sticking closer to the EU than they had thought in 2016. In 2016, the impression was, we get out of the EU and there's a glorious world, free trade, multilateral system, and we are protected by that system. We don't need the EU. Now the impression is a little bit different.
Yeah.
So in the end, Trump and Brexit might have the same roots, but now I think they are parting company.
Interesting. Professor Begg, what about that? When President Trump traveled to the UK and to the EU countries, there were demonstrations following him throughout the traveling route. So would that make the British people think twice? Those demonstrations, including those in the UK. So would that make the UK people think twice about what kind of future they want? The siren already sounding at the background. Professor Begg, you want to help us to understand it?
Yes, the siren's just across the road from me outside the House of Commons, so maybe something's going on there. But I think the answer is that the British people are deeply split. There are many, particularly in London, who are quite happy with the global context. They welcome globalization, and there are many in other parts of the country who strongly resist it, and this lay behind some of the voting patterns we saw in Brexit. The result of the referendum is a much more divided country, and that's what makes it so much more difficult to articulate a single position on what the UK wants.
Exactly.
As you know, I'm Scottish. The Scots voted differently from the English. The English voted differently from the Welsh and the Northern Irish. You find sectarian patterns in Northern Ireland. All these things feed into what has become a very, very uncomfortable debate, not just about Brexit, not just about European Union, but also about relations with the rest of the world.
Right.
And you see this even with the reactions to Trump.
So, Professor Begg, as a result of that, wouldn't that be so easy these days for politicians, for their own interests, their own little political interests, to hijack the whole nation's so-called national interests as a result of the division going on in the country, as a result of lack of ways to really assess what exactly those interests should be and are? Professor.
Well, the cynical answer is that the whole Brexit process dating back to 2013, when David Cameron first announced his intention to have a referendum, has been about internal Conservative Party politics. All the machinations we've seen over the last few weeks, the Chequers deal, the resignations from the government, these have been about internal Conservative Party politics. And sadly, we're no better endowed on the other side of the political spectrum with the Labour Party, which continues not to have a single coherent position on either Brexit or what kind of deal we're looking for. We are badly served by our politicians.
Unfortunately. We only have less than 2 minutes to go.
Indeed.
Let me also have some views coming from Mr. Gross about that.
Of course, politics is always local. Therefore, it's understandable that you have different opinions. But I think perhaps the situation is not as dramatic as it appears. Professor Beck said we need an agreement very soon. But I would propose that maybe we can have just a fudge towards the end of this year, because after Brexit we have the interim period where everything for a while will continue as before, and maybe we'll have to give the UK perhaps more time so that it can really think over how it comes to grips with its own contradictions.
Right.
And then maybe we agree on the final relationship only in 1 or 2 years.
I see. Mr. Cui, before we go, also more than 30 seconds for you, sir.
Okay, I think now it's also a bigger test, not only for the internal politics, of course, in UK, and also not the wisdom of Theresa May and her colleagues. And also it's also a big test for European Union side. But anyway, because a kind of a softer landing of this very big issue, I mean Brexit, will be beneficial not only for UK and also for European Union. Otherwise, I think there will be a lose-lose situation for both countries.
That is always the rule, isn't it? But will that rule be followed? We'll see. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us in this ever-going debate. Cui Hongjian, Ian Beck, Daniel Gross, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Robust growth for China's economy in the first half of this year. Could a trade war factor in the second half? We'll ask our panelists after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program comes to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. China's economic growth for the first half of 2018 has maintained its momentum. The figure from the National Statistics Bureau shows China's GDP posted a 6.8% year-on-year growth. Consumption and service industries contributed over 60% to the growth. Another 1/3 of the growth was due to the rapid development of emerging industries and new business models. China is confident of achieving the growth target set at the beginning of this year, despite the recent trade tensions with the U.S. The International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, warned a trade war could derail global recovery. According to WTO, China's contribution to the growth of global imports was more than 1/10 in the first quarter of this year. For more on China's economic For more on China's economic data, we are joined in Beijing Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, sir. In Hong Kong, we have Hong Hao, Managing Director and Head of Research at Bocom International. Welcome as well. In Washington, D.C., last but not least, we have Yukong Huang, who is a Senior Associate of the Carnegie Asia Program, where his research focuses on China's economic development and its impact on Asia and the global economy. It's wonderful to see you once again, Mr. Huang. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Liu, here in Beijing, the number robust still. What kind of message is China trying to send, obviously, to the rest of the world?
I cannot think of a better picture for at least by the statistical figures, because it shows two very much of the key word, which is stability and also positive prospect. The agriculture, the manufacturer service sector, they are displaying a high resilience over a number of challenges. But one thing I really feel confused if you read the other part of the picture is that the revenue, the government revenue has really reached more than 10%, whereas the disposable income of the individuals remain at 6.6. So this 4% gap really confused me.
Does that confuse you, Mr. Huang?
Well, I think the first half economic financial statistics are quite good, but if you look closely, you see some signs of concerns. Infrastructure investment is slackened a bit, so is industrial production. The trade data looks pretty good because exporters have shipped ahead of the potential trade war. And the budget situation looks pretty good because local government spending has not been as strong as people would like. And then I think that's why you see the difference. The revenues are pretty good, but expenditures are not very high. And I think this is the question for the second half. To what extent should the government try to actually expand the economy to a little bit because of the potential negative consequences of the trade war?
Talking about the trade war, China's Commerce Ministry also announced the total trade volume reached that is $21 trillion in the first half of this year, marking an annual growth rate of 16%. If you take a look at these numbers, exports, imports numbers are all showing robust economic development. Despite trade tensions, China's trade volume with the U.S. increased 5.7%, and its trade volume with some countries along the Belt and Road had also rapid growth. According to WTO, China's contribution to the growth of global imports was more than 13% in the first quarter of this year. Of course, Mr. Hong, having read all of these numbers, one could argue, you know, the trade war did not start that early in the year, and therefore it is having a mild impact on all of these numbers we're showing for the first half, at least. But that does show a potential trend of how the trade should be going if those political risks can be avoided eventually. Mr. Hong. Mr. Hong.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very strong set of numbers. Obviously, the trade war started, well, probably announced around first quarter. So, you know, we're yet to see the impact of the trade war coming through to the trade numbers. And also keep in mind that, you know, because of the impending trade war and the risk of trading with other nations associated with impending trade war, many of the export orders would have been predated. Right, so people wanted to ship their orders out before the tariff being imposed on many of the goods. So, you know, I would say that, yeah, it is a very strong set of numbers, but I don't think the numbers, this set of numbers actually reflect the impact of trade war that is coming in the second half.
May I just follow up with you, Mr. Hong, about that, because the IMF for this year talking about 3.9%, things are getting beautiful, rosy in a way. Of course, IMF warned about the trade war's impact on the overall global economy, but we have yet to see the real impact of the trade war, because this is certainly not just between two countries. It's going to have a tremendous impact when you think about the ripple effects. Having said that, though,
that's right.
Inside the United States, there are already investors over the past 2 days suggesting the U.S. economy, which is recovering with beautiful jobs growth, as well as employment opportunities, as well as GDP growth, could have been hampered as a result of the recent trade war, and therefore not enjoy prosperity as much as they should be. So, Mr. Hong, from an economist's perspective, what do you make of that? But on the other hand, you see, Mr. Hong, this is the time when President Trump argued, well, that's the best time, let's start a trade war, because we're likely to lose fewer jobs because there are jobs growth already. So what do you make of this, you know, comments coming from both sides?
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, no one really wins in a trade war. So even if, you know, at the moment the U.S. seems to be ahead, you know, because of a very strong set of economic numbers and also a very strong performing equity markets in the U.S. Now, you know, the problem with that is that it actually bolsters Trump's resolve to start a trade war and to continue. So, you know, sooner or later, you know, the impact of a trade war will be reflected in U.S. economic numbers and also the U.S. stock markets that refuse to correct so far this year.
Mr. Huang, I would love to go to you also about that. You heard about the CEO coming from BlackRock. That is one whose hand has trillions of dollars, talking today about the tremendous impact a trade war could have on the investment environment inside the United States, as well as the recovery of the U.S. economy, Mr. Huang.
Well, the consequences of a trade war take time to show up. It takes about 3 to 6 months for the impact to show up on trade, information, export, and import numbers. It takes about a year for the changes in investments, the relocation of plants, who you order from to show up. So you're going to see the effect occurring, let's say, this fall, this winter, and next year more than today. It's true that the American economy is very, very strong, but what the trade war means is they will not be growing as rapidly as they had projected. For China, the forecasts today are that if the full $200 billion of trade-related tariffs are levied over the next couple of months, this could actually have an impact of, let's say, minus 0.3% or even more on China's growth, say, starting from the end of this year into next.
Professor Liu, I guess the question for China could also be answered by you as well. I mean, on the one hand, as Mr. Huang just said, the impact of trade war certainly will be reflected in the Chinese economy, no doubt about that, bigger or smaller. That has to eventually look at the realities. But on the other hand, China is trying to push what they call the structural reform, mainly to focus its economy not onto the exports anymore, but rather on domestic consumption. So will this thing, so-called the negative impact of the trade war, in a way encourage China to turn that corner in a more efficient and more determined mind?
Yes, it turned out to be a propeller, actually, for China to engage in three...
Propeller skin deep or more than skin deep? That is the question.
Now, I think in the first place, the ZTE case really is really a very bone deep wake-up for China, you know, to engage in innovation based on the very basic infrastructure technologies. And the other is that it also pushes China to really see the larger value of defending a global multinational trading network and also dispute settlement platform. And then it also pushes China to look for more diversification over its market policy in terms of supply and also in the end consumer markets. And of course, it pushes China to further upgrade its industrial structure by pushing forward more innovation to help as part of the supply side reform.
Mr. Hong, that is the hope, at least, isn't it? If you see, China has been making very good use of some of the outside pressure throughout the past 40 years during reform and opening up to make sure some of the critical moments that China would make the right choice. That could be the reference that China can rely on. And yet, will this one be the same, Mr. Hong? That is the question, isn't it?
Yeah, but well, I guess, you know, despite the trade war, I think China actually pushed forward with its reform and open plan. You know, for example, even though the new tariff has been announced, you know, China continued to push to open its financial sector as well as many other sectors, and also lower import tariff on many industries. For example, the car imports tariff as well. So, you know, I would say that, you know, despite the pressure, I think China is continue onto its reform and open scheme, and I think, you know, that is the right course of action to take, you know, in light of, you know, the trade war pressure that the U.S. president is trying to impose onto China.
Mr. Huang, coming from Washington yourself, though you have been working in China continuously for years then with the World Bank, what do you make of the internal debate as well as the interactions of narratives between what is going on in China right now and certainly that trade war apparently between China and the United States regarding the economic impact?
Well, what you see today is a American policy that essentially says that America can go it alone. They no longer need allies. They don't need allies in Asia. They don't even need allies in Europe. And that's because America thinks that past policies in some ways have not been actually helpful to Americans' interests. I think it's a wrong perception. And you see that comment coming out very, very strongly. So the challenge for China is how to address this. How do I address the fact that we're moving away from a rules-based system? And I think the recent discussions in Beijing between the EU and China is perhaps one solution. That is that Europe and China work much harder on forging what I call a more liberal and open trade and investment regime, and then openly express stronger support for a rules-based system and even for strengthening WTO. And if this works, if you can really make a lot of progress on this, it might then be able to counteract what I would call some of the negative signals on protectionism that's coming out of Washington.
But Mr. Huang, may I just follow up on that? You see, there are partners that has been long. For example, allied relations between Washington and the European capitals. That has been there since the Second World War. And yet, the relationship between China and the European countries are quite new in a way when you think about a strategic partnership in a new era. And therefore, how fast that bond will be nurtured and how much same dream that all parties have to have in their mind in order to get the agenda on track is a big question. Having said that, though, Mr. Huang, I do want you to help us about to understand better about that, about partnership in a new era, in a way.
Now, I think you're absolutely correct in emphasizing that the U.S.-Europe partnership, the alliance, has been there historically. It's very, very strong. The relationship between Europe and China and many of these concerns in terms of politics, foreign relations are much weaker. But think about what's happening. You have the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to establish a bridge between China through Middle and Central Asia to Europe, and that's a link that's going to be built. But what people don't realize, actually, is that Europe's foreign investment in China over the last 10, 15 years has been running about twice as high as America's investment in China. So Europe's trade relationship actually is much stronger. Europe, in terms of its production processes, their contribution to value added and production in China for exports is about 3 times as large as America's is. And that, again, is not self-evident to many people. So economically, in terms of both trade and foreign investment, Europe actually is more integrated into the Chinese economy than America is. But politically or publicly, that's not so self-evident. Now, this forms a potential basis because it can provide a basis for what I would call stronger political and foreign policy links. And that needs to be actually worked upon if this kind of alliance between China and Europe is to have any effect in shaping what I would call global governance rules, the rules of the game governing trade and investment.
Right. There's many segments of that story, of course. For now, we're only talking about the very early age of that story. Professor Liu, what do you think? I mean, having said all of this, our topic today is about China's economy. Our topic today is about the world economy. And therefore, what are some of the factors you would suggest us to look very closely regarding the backdrop of a trade war apparently going on for the national economy and certainly for the economy of the world for the second half of this year? Professor, briefly.
Well, I think now China is having this wake-up call, and China is for sure making further moves over its open door policy. So China firmly believes that the more liberal economic policy can really generate the positive impact both internally and also on the global marketplace. And the other is, we would like to ally with more of those victims of the U.S. policy so that we can really fight against the protectionist sentiments.
I see. Before we go, 20 seconds left for each of the other 2 guests. Mr. Hong, you want to go first? 20 seconds. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I guess, in light of what's happening, the Chinese economy is doing exceedingly well, and that actually gives us some reasonable base, to be strong, in a trade war negotiation.
I see. Mr. Huang, finally for you as well, 20 seconds.
Well, you know, this is an unnecessary trade war in the sense that everybody's suffering. But I think China has no choice. It basically has to move forward in terms of the structure and the strategy that it has laid out for itself. And if it does so, then I think it can survive.
Silver lining of a cloud, you never know whether it's going to work in your advantage. I mean, in the world's advantage too. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Liu Baocheng, Hong Hao, Yu Kong Huang, really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From Mi Tianwei and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.